The dust of Promise Creek clung to the hem of her white dress, a dress that had been pristine in San Francisco, but was now a map of her journey, charted in grime and disappointment. Aunt May stood beside her trunk on the splintered train platform, a solitary island in a sea of bustling, unfamiliar faces. The locomotive hissed a final, weary sigh, its steam mingling with the oppressive heat of the Wyoming summer. He was late. Mr. Henderson, the man whose photograph she had studied for months, the man whose letters had promised a respectable life, was late. And then he was there. Not the smiling man from the tintype, but a pinched, sour-faced merchant whose eyes swept over her with the dismissive air of a man inspecting livestock. He circled her once, his gaze lingering on her travel-worn attire, the delicate slope of her shoulders, the foreignness of her features. He did not speak to her. He addressed the station master, his voice a sharp, cutting blade in the thick air. "This is not what was described. There has been a mistake. I cannot accept this." The station master, a man with a drooping mustache and tired eyes, merely shrugged. The transaction was a private matter. Aunt May understood the words, if not the precise context. The meaning, however, was brutally clear. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. Whispers erupted from the onlookers, a low murmur of speculation and cruel curiosity. She was a curiosity, a piece of mail returned to sender. Her world, already balanced on a pinhead, crumbled. She had nowhere to go. Her money was gone, spent on the passage that had brought her to this precise moment of ruin. Her trunk contained everything she owned, 2 other dresses, a book of poetry, and her mother's jade pendant. She lowered her eyes to the rough planks of the platform, willing herself to become invisible. Then a shadow fell over her. It was vast, eclipsing the harsh afternoon sun. She looked up, past a pair of enormous, scuffed leather boots, up a pair of legs thick as young trees, over a broad chest covered in a simple wool shirt, to a face framed by a wild mane of dark brown hair and a full, untrimmed beard. The man was immense, a giant carved from the mountains that loomed on the horizon. His eyes, a startling clear blue, were not cruel or mocking. They were steady, observant. He looked from her to the departing back of Mr. Henderson, then down to the trunk at her feet. Without a word, he bent, his massive frame folding with surprising grace. His hand, calloused and wide as a dinner plate, closed around the leather handle of her trunk. He lifted it as if it were a child's toy. He straightened, his gaze meeting hers. A low, rumbling voice, quiet but resonant, spoke a single, impossible word. "Wife." Aunt May stared, frozen. The word hung in the air, a stone thrown into the silent pool of her despair. It made no sense. This man, this mountain creature, could not be speaking to her. It was another cruelty, a jest at her expense. She looked around, expecting to see the townspeople laughing, but their faces were a mixture of shock and wary respect for the giant who stood before her. He did not seem the sort of man one laughed at. He simply waited, his blue eyes holding hers, his expression unreadable beneath the thicket of his beard. He had claimed her as casually as he had lifted her trunk, a statement of fact, not a question. She found her voice, a small, wavering thing. "Sir, I do not understand." He shifted the trunk to his other hand, the movement effortless. "Mr. Henderson does not want a wife," he stated, his voice a low rumble. "I do. I have a claim in the mountains, a cabin. It is a long walk." He paused, letting the simple, unadorned facts settle. "I need a partner, someone to keep the house. It will not be an easy life, but it will be a life." He was not offering romance. He was proposing a contract, as stark and practical as the landscape around them. She saw the options laid out before her with brutal clarity. She could remain here, a returned bride, and face the grim prospects available to a lone, penniless woman of her race in a town like this. Or she could go with this stranger, this enormous, silent man, into the unknown wilderness. One path led to certain degradation, the other to a terrifying uncertainty that at least held the shape of survival. He had not touched her, had not even moved closer. He stood his ground, giving her space to make her choice, his presence a silent promise of protection, or perhaps a different kind of cage. She looked at his hands, strong and capable. She looked at his eyes, which held no hint of the leering curiosity or cold disdain she had seen in so many others. They were just steady. She thought of the long journey across the ocean, the hope that had dwindled with every passing mile, and the final, shattering rejection. She had come this far. She could not break now. Taking a slow, deep breath that tasted of dust and freedom, An Mei gave a single, decisive nod. A flicker of something, relief perhaps, passed through his eyes. He turned without another word and began to walk away from the station, her trunk in his hand. She hesitated for only a heartbeat before falling into step behind him, her old white dress a stark contrast to his rugged form as they left the town of Promise Creek and headed toward the distant blue-shadowed mountains. The journey was a silent pilgrimage. The man, who eventually offered his name as Jacob, did not press her for conversation. He seemed to exist within a fortress of quiet, his thoughts as contained as the immense strength in his limbs. He walked with a long, ground-eating stride, yet he tempered his pace to hers, never moving so far ahead that she felt abandoned. The dust of the flatlands slowly gave way to the scent of pine and damp earth as the trail began to climb. An Mei's thin shoes, not made for such terrain, soon pinched and rubbed, but she said nothing, clenching her jaw against the discomfort. Complaining was a luxury she did not have. She watched him, studying him with the intense focus of a creature assessing a potential predator. He moved with an economy of motion, his body attuned to the wilderness. He pointed out a hawk circling high above, the track of a deer pressed into the soft earth beside the trail, a patch of wild berries safe to eat. These were his words, small offerings of knowledge that created a fragile bridge between their two disparate worlds. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, they arrived. The cabin was nestled in a small clearing, flanked by towering pines. It was not a crude shack, but a solid structure of hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a welcoming plume against the deepening twilight. It was a place of solitude, a bastion against the world. Jacob set her trunk down on the porch. "This is it." He pushed the door open, revealing a single large room. It was sparse and overwhelmingly masculine, but immaculately clean. A large stone hearth dominated one wall. A sturdy table and 2 chairs sat in the center. A bed, neatly made with a thick wool blanket, occupied one corner, while shelves holding tins, sacks of flour, and a few well-worn books lined another wall. He gestured to a small door she hadn't noticed. "That room is for you. It's small, but it's yours." Relief washed over her. He was giving her privacy, a space of her own. The room was little more than a closet with a narrow cot, but it felt like a kingdom. When she emerged, he had a fire crackling in the hearth and was slicing thick pieces of bread from a loaf on the table. He gestured for her to sit. The meal was simple: bread, cheese, and water from a bucket he'd drawn from a well outside, but it was the first food she had eaten with a sense of security in days. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind in the pines outside. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but a functional one. the quiet of two people who had struck a bargain and were now beginning the slow, cautious process of living with its terms. The days bled into weeks, and summer settled deep into the mountain valleys. Aunt May found a rhythm in the quiet solitude of the cabin, a routine that anchored her. She rose with the sun, the cool mountain air a balm after the oppressive heat of the lowlands. Jacob was always gone by then, tending to his traps or felling timber further up the mountain. His absence gave her the freedom to make the space her own. She began with small acts of transformation. She washed the single window until it gleamed, letting in the full measure of the morning light. Using a spare flour sack, she stitched a simple curtain, a small act of domesticity that softened the room's harsh lines. She scrubbed the floors, organized the shelves, and learned the temperament of the cast-iron stove, coaxing from it fragrant loaves of bread that filled the cabin with a scent of home she had not known she was missing. Outside the cabin was a small, neglected patch of earth where the sun lingered longest. She saw potential in it. With a rusty spade she found in the lean-to, she began to turn the soil, her hands, once accustomed to ink brushes and fine needlework, becoming calloused and strong. Jacob returned one evening from a trip to town for supplies, his mule laden with sacks. He said nothing, but the next morning she found a small cloth bag on the kitchen table. Inside were seeds, beans, squash, and hardy greens. It was a silent acknowledgment, a gesture of support that spoke more than a dozen pleasantries. Their conversations were sparse, built of necessity. "The flour is low," she would say. "I will go to town next week," he would reply. But slowly the topics broadened. She asked about the names of the wildflowers that grew in the meadow. He, in turn, asked how she knew which mushrooms were safe to gather. She told him of the markets in her home province, the vibrant colors and smells. He described the brutal beauty of a mountain winter, the deep silence of the snow. One evening she found him staring at the book of poetry she had left on a shelf. It was in her native tongue. "What do they say?" he asked, his voice rough with disuse. She took the book, her fingers tracing the familiar characters. She chose a simple verse about the moon rising over a river and translated it for him, her voice soft in the firelight. He listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the flames. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment before nodding slowly. "It is good," he said, a simple verdict that felt like high praise. They were two solitary people, slowly, cautiously, learning the language of each other's presence. The need for supplies eventually grew pressing enough to warrant a journey to Promise Creek. Aunt May felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach at the thought of returning to the place of her humiliation. Jacob seemed to sense her unease. "I will be with you," he said, the simple statement a solid reassurance. The town looked the same, dusty and sun-baked, but she felt different. She was no longer a lone, discarded object. She walked beside Jacob, his towering presence a shield against the curious stares and whispered comments that still followed her. In the mercantile, while Jacob negotiated with the proprietor for flour and salt, she felt a familiar, chilling gaze upon her. She turned to see Mr. Henderson standing by the counter, a pale, sour-faced woman in a prim bonnet on his arm. His eyes narrowed with contempt as he took in her simple, clean dress and the way she stood near the mountain man. He could not abide the sight of her, not just surviving, but seemingly content. He spoke to the man beside him, his voice loud enough to carry across the store. "Some men have a taste for damaged goods, I suppose. Happy to take another man's leftovers." The words struck Aunt May like a physical blow, and the color drained from her face. The store fell silent. Before she could retreat into herself, Jacob moved. He did not raise his voice or his hands. He simply straightened to his full, formidable height and took a single step forward, placing himself between Aunt May and Henderson. The sheer size of him seemed to suck the air out of the room. He looked down at the smaller man, his blue eyes as cold and hard as winter ice. "You will not speak to my wife," he said. His voice was a low, deadly, quiet growl that promised consequences far more severe than a simple brawl. "Ever. Again." Henderson, who had puffed himself up with petty pride, visibly deflated. He stammered something incoherent, grabbed his wife's arm, and scurried from the store like a frightened rodent. Jacob watched him go, his posture unyielding. Then he turned back to the counter, his demeanor once again calm. "We'll also need a bag of nails," he said to the wide-eyed store owner, as if nothing had happened. He paid for their goods, loaded them onto the mule, and helped Aunt May onto the wagon seat. He had not looked at her since the confrontation, but as he took the reins beside her, she saw that the rigid set of his jaw had not yet softened. He had defended her, not as property, but as a person, as his wife. The ride back to the mountains was shrouded in a thick, charged silence. Aunt May replayed the scene in the mercantile over and over in her mind. She felt the sting of Henderson's insult, but it was overshadowed by the powerful memory of Jacob's defense. He had stood before her like a fortress wall, absorbing the blow meant for her. He had called her his wife, and for the first time the word had not sounded like a term of convenience, but a declaration of belonging. They arrived at the cabin as the sun was bleeding orange and purple across the western sky. Jacob unhitched the mule and began to unload their supplies, his movements still stiff with a contained anger. Aunt May started to carry a sack of flour inside, but she stopped on the porch, turning to face him as he approached with a heavy crate. "Jacob," she said, her voice quiet but firm, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You did not have to do that." He set the crate down with a thud. For a moment she thought he would retreat back into his usual silence, but instead a muscle worked in his jaw. "Yes," he said, the word raspy with emotion. "I did." He looked away from her, toward the vast expanse of the valley below, his broad shoulders slumping slightly. "My mother, she was a good woman, quiet, worked herself to the bone. My father was not a kind man. I watched men like Henderson look at her with pity or scorn her whole life. I would not see that look cast on you." The confession hung in the air between them, a piece of his closely guarded past laid bare. He turned back to her, his blue eyes dark with an intensity she had never seen before. "When I spoke at the station, it was a solution to a problem, for both of us." He took a hesitant step closer, his large frame seeming to fill the entire world. "It is not that anymore, Aunt May." He slowly raised a hand, his calloused fingers trembling slightly as he gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark in the twilight. "It is not that at all." He searched her eyes for a sign, any sign of rejection. Finding none, he lowered his head, his beard soft against her skin as his lips met hers. The kiss was hesitant at first, a question. Then, as she leaned into him, her hands coming to rest on his chest, it deepened, becoming a tender, profound confirmation of everything that had grown unspoken between them in the quiet heart of the mountains. The kiss changed everything. The carefully constructed walls of their practical arrangement crumbled, revealing the sturdy foundation of something far deeper. The next morning, the air in the cabin was different, charged with a new intimacy. The silence between them was no longer one of cautious distance, but of comfortable companionship. A few days later, as they sat at the table sharing their evening meal, Jacob spoke, his voice steady. "We should see the preacher." Aunt May looked up from her plate, her heart giving a small lurch. "The town?" "Not for the town," he said, meeting her gaze. "For us." A week later they rode the wagon down the mountain again. This time there was no anxiety, only a quiet sense of purpose. The traveling preacher, a thin, kind-eyed man named Mr. Davies, met them in the small, clapboard church. He listened to Jacob's request without judgment. The general store owner, Mr. Gable, and his wife Clara stood as their witnesses, their presence a quiet validation of the bond that had formed so far from the town's prying eyes. The ceremony was simple, devoid of fanfare. They stood before the altar, the afternoon light filtering through the plain glass windows. Aunt May wore her best dress, the one she had saved for a life she thought was lost to her. Jacob wore a clean shirt, his hair and beard neatly combed. He looked immense and solid beside her. The preacher's words were about partnership, respect, and building a life together. When it was time for the vows, Jacob's voice was a low, earnest rumble as he promised to honor and protect her. Aunt May's voice was soft but clear as she made her pledge in return. It was not a contract anymore, it was a covenant. She was not a returned bride or a convenient solution. She was Jacob's wife, in her heart and now before God. As they left the church, Jacob's large hand enveloped hers, his thumb stroking the back of her fingers. The journey home was filled with a new and easy peace. That night, the small, separate room at the back of the cabin remained empty. By the warm, flickering light of a single lantern, Jacob came to her. There was no awkwardness, only a profound sense of homecoming. He was gentle, his rough hands surprisingly tender as he undid the buttons on her dress. In the quiet of their mountain home, surrounded by the whispering pines, they became husband and wife in every sense of the word, their union sealed not by a business transaction, but by a slow-burning, hard-won love. Time marked its passage in the turning of the seasons. The vibrant green of summer deepened into the gold and crimson of autumn. The harvest from Aunt May's garden was bountiful. They worked together, pickling beans, drying squash, and storing potatoes and carrots in the small root cellar Jacob dug beneath the cabin. The shelves inside, once sparse, were now laden with jars of preserves, a colorful testament to their shared labor and growing prosperity. Winter arrived with a hush, blanketing the mountains in a thick layer of snow. The world outside became silent and still, and the cabin became their sanctuary. The isolation that might have driven others apart only drew them closer. Aunt May mended Jacob's shirts by the firelight, the rhythmic pull of the needle a soothing counterpoint to the howling wind. Jacob, in turn, spent the long evenings reinforcing the cabin, his hammer blows echoing with a sense of permanence. He added a new room onto the side of the cabin, a space with a large window facing the sunrise. "For your plants in the winter," he said, though they both knew it was more than that. It was a room for their future. One afternoon, checking his trap lines, Jacob found a young fox with its leg caught in a poacher's abandoned snare. He carefully freed the terrified animal and brought it home, wrapped in his coat. Together, he and Aunt May cleaned the wound and splinted the delicate leg. They kept the fox in a warm box by the hearth, and Aunt May fed it scraps of meat and broth. The small, wounded creature, so fiercely guarded, slowly began to trust them. Its healing mirrored their own journey, two abandoned souls who had found unexpected care and a place to mend. The gentle banter that had begun in the summer now flowed easily between them. She would tease him about the prodigious amount of wood he chopped, and he would smile, a rare and wonderful sight that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and tell her it was to keep his wife warm. The cabin was no longer just his shelter or her refuge. It was their home, infused with the warmth of their shared life, a beacon of light and love against the vast, indifferent wilderness. Their life was a quiet tapestry woven from threads of mutual respect, gentle affection, and the deep, unspoken understanding that they belonged to each other. Spring returned to the mountains with a surge of life. The snow receded, and the creeks swelled with meltwater. The first green shoots pushed their way through the damp earth, and the air grew sweet with the scent of pine and thawing soil. Aunt May's garden, expanded and enriched with compost from the winter, was her pride. She and Jacob worked side by side, turning the earth and planting the seeds for the coming season. What had once been a small patch of dirt was now a sprawling plot, a testament to her persistence and his support. One evening they stood on the porch Jacob had built, a sturdy addition that overlooked the valley. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of soft pink and brilliant orange. Aunt May leaned against the railing, her hands resting on the smooth, worn wood. Jacob came to stand behind her, his large frame a familiar comfort. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned her head back, resting it on his shoulder. They stood like that for a long time, watching the colors fade and the first stars appear. "This is a good life, Jacob," she said, her voice soft with contentment. She felt his chest rumble with a low hum of agreement. He pressed a light kiss to the top of her head. "It is a good life, because you are in it," he answered, his voice simple and sincere. The words were a profound declaration, a summary of their entire journey. From the dust of the train station to this peaceful moment, her presence had been the catalyst for transformation, not just for the cabin, but for him. She reached up and placed her hand over his, her slender fingers lacing with his strong, calloused ones. They were no longer just surviving. They were thriving. The home they had built, the land they cultivated, the quiet rhythm of their days, it was all a testament to the future they were creating together. The mountain was no longer a place of isolation, but the heart of their world. There was a sense of permanence here, a feeling that what they had built with their own hands and their own hearts would endure, a legacy of love planted in the wilderness, destined to grow for generations to come. The future was no longer an unknown terror, but a peaceful expanse, a continuation of this very moment. A year and a half after Aunt May had first arrived in Promise Creek, they rode the wagon into town again. The journey felt routine now, a familiar part of their life's rhythm. But as they moved through the main street, Aunt May noticed a change. The stares were still there, but they were different. The open hostility and mocking curiosity had been replaced by a grudging, and in some cases, genuine respect. They were no longer the strange mountain man and his foreign bride. They were the Calloway family, a known quantity, a part of the local tapestry. Mrs. Gable waved warmly from the doorway of the mercantile, and even the blacksmith gave Jacob a respectful nod. They had weathered the town's judgment and emerged stronger, their quiet endurance earning them a place. As they loaded their supplies, a familiar figure emerged from the saloon. It was Mr. Henderson. He looked thinner, more pinched than she remembered, his suit slightly frayed at the cuffs. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second, and in them she saw not arrogance, but a flicker of something akin to envy. He quickly looked away, hurrying down the street, a man diminished by his own smallness. He was no longer a source of pain, merely a ghost, a marker of a life she had thankfully left behind. The true measure of her life was not in the town's acceptance, but in the home that awaited them in the mountains. They arrived back at the cabin as the last rays of sunlight kissed the peaks. The garden was flourishing, a riot of green leaves and burgeoning vegetables. Her flowers, planted along the porch, filled the air with a sweet perfume. Jacob came to stand beside her as she inspected a budding rose. He didn't speak, but his presence was a comforting weight. He had brought her a cutting from a wild rose bush months ago, and she had nurtured it into this thriving plant. It felt like a symbol of their life together. He reached out, his hand gently settling on the small swell of her belly, a new and precious secret they held between them. He bent his head, his beard brushing her neck as he placed a soft kiss just below her ear. She smiled, leaning back into his embrace, her hand covering his. She remembered the girl in the faded white dress, standing alone on a train platform, an object returned and rejected. That girl felt like a character from a distant story. Here, in the arms of her husband, her home a beacon of warmth against the vast, beautiful wilderness, she was not an object, but the heart of a family. The word Jacob had spoken that first day, the one that had saved her, echoed in her soul, no longer a label of convenience, but the truest and most cherished part of her identity. Wife, home, love.